Erev Tov, good evening, and thank you for coming this evening to the Feld Memorial Lecture. The Cloud Library is delighted to have Professor Alexandra Gillespie. Dr. Gillespie is a Vice President of the University of Toronto and a Principal of the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where she is a Professor of English, Medieval Studies, and Global Book History. Her research and teaching range widely, from the poetics of Chaucer's Canterbury tales to the history of text technologies, from scientific approaches to book history to literary theory and philosophy. On these topics, she has published more than 50 articles and 6 co-edited volumes, plus a monograph titled, I have the book, I'm sorry, I want to show you the book, Print, Culture, and the Medieval Author. It's an excellent book. Her new monograph, Chaucer book, is forthcoming. And her current research project that we heard about this afternoon, or morning, I forgot, interdisciplinary, supported by the Mellon Foundation, brings together more than 130 collaborators from 60 institutions around the world to develop new interdisciplinary understandings of pre-modern books in their local and global contexts. We are so grateful to have Dr. Gillespie with us tonight. I would like to thank Abigail Becken and Melissa and Jordan and all the library staff for all of their hard work putting this evening together. I would also like to thank the JCC, the Dean's Office, and the Cincinnati Foundation for supporting this event. Please welcome Dr. Gillespie.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and thank all of you truly for the honor of giving this year's Feld Lecture. I think some of you know that I am giving it because I was able to step in when our colleague, Professor Elisheva Kalbach, was unable to attend. And that means I have to beg your forgiveness for some haste in preparing the lecture. For example, I didn't include some sources for some of the images and quotations on my slide. Now, that's the kind of thing when you're a bibliographer and a book historian, you have to stand up in front of librarians, you have to stand up and confess. But perhaps more importantly, I must not, if not apologize, I told one of you that I wouldn't apologize, I must explain. I'm a new student on the topic I'm speaking to you about, the early printing of Hebrew texts. I trained as a book historian in and for English literature departments, starting back in my home country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. But I've slowly morphed as a researcher into someone who convenes and sometimes does collaborative interdisciplinary research on the global book. Currently, as you just heard, with Mellon funding in a project called Hidden Stories. Can I have the next slide, please? You can. I can. Do I just? Yep. Oh.
Swipe.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book. My research has led me to a position, and that position, I have many positions, but this is one of them, that stories about Hebrew and Jewish books can transform parts of my academic field that are in need, thank you, I think that I'll be better at this, that are in need of transformation. But this will only be so if we can correct a situation that the great Jewish book historian Alexander Marx first described in 1924, the, quote, unfortunate lack of cooperation between the specialists in Hebrew studies and those of other branches of bookish research. The problem is not, I think, on the Jewish studies side. Rather, those of us undertaking large-scale, longue-durée histories of communication technologies need to pay more attention to the work of colleagues on millennia of Jewish books. Those of us who don't read Hebrew, and that's me included, have to do that cooperatively. So for my own part, I'm privileged to be working alongside and learning slowly from Dr. Noam Sienna, an incoming postdoctoral fellow in the U of T Hidden Stories project. I'm also learning from Dr. Nadav Sharon, curator of Judaica at Thomas Fisher's Rare Book Library, and from my co-PI, Professor Suzanne Akbari, and a group of scholars of global Judaica she has assembled for the Hidden Stories project. I have a group of friends in Toronto who work in other parts of Jewish studies. I want to name check them, Professors Anna Sternchus, Eilert Cooper, and Renan Levine, who have heard some of what I'm going to say today and helped me refine it. And finally, I have learned much from the distinguished scholars of early modern Hebraic and Jewish books at today's conference at the Clow Library. I spent a lot of the time today, I think people thought I was doing my email, but I wasn't. I switched my email off and the provost doesn't know where I am. So good. In fact, I was constantly refining my paper as I was learning things during the day and like putting extra slides in and all sorts. I am so grateful for the generous help I've received for my thinking because it has allowed me to begin some work that I think matters, now perhaps more than ever. I'm thinking here of work done across academic fields, work that connects the histories of different peoples, allowing us to tell truer stories about the past and to tell them against division and harm. I'm offering my talk in a time of grief. I am sorry for terrible losses. I'm worried, as we all are, for the future. But I also offer this talk in gratitude and in the hope of better days to come. And in that spirit, on to my talk. It will eventually be about early Hebrew printing, like it said. But in the first half, I want to frame my stories about Jewish books by explaining how stories about early printing have distorted the field of book history. And I'm going to start here. Let's just check I'm clicking the right thing. No, this one. Try that one. Oh, backwards. Forwards. Got it. Okay. This is text from the 1570 edition of the Acts and Monuments, a collection of stories of religious martyrs by the English Protestant reformer John Foxe. Foxe here takes up the topic of movable type hand press printing, by that time 150-year-old European bookmaking technology. Now, writes Foxe, by this printing as by the gift of tongues, and as by the singular organ of the Holy Ghost, the doctrine of the gospel soundeth to all nations and countries under heaven, and what God revealeth to one man is dispersed to many, and what is known in one nation is open to all. In the unreformed past, Foxe explains, begging friars, scraping all the wealth from other priests, heaped up all books that could be gotten into their own libraries. But the book could not be so contained forever. As printing of books ministered matter of reading, so reading brought learning, learning showed light. By the brightness whereof blind ignorance was suppressed, God's glory with truth of his word advanced. Foxe is actually wrestling quietly with a problem in this passage. If books promote learning and learning shows light, then how to explain why all the heaps of books of history did not suppress the Roman Church a little sooner? Having blamed Christian monkish hoarding of such books, he reaches for understanding by way of an older recrimination, an archetypal hatred. No, back. There we go. He says, well may this gift of printing be resembled to the gift of tongues, for like as God then spake with many tongues, and yet all that would not turn the Jews, so now when the Holy Ghost speaketh to the adversaries in innumerable sorts of books, yet they will not be converted. So thanks to the printing press, what God revealeth to one man is dispersed to many, but even innumerable books have not produced uniformity of religion, not even in England, let alone among all nations. Foxe rejoices because printing can move what he deems God's truth all around the world, but he also pauses because God's truth, even in print, has yet to convert Protestant Christianity's adversaries. The Jewish nation, which almost 200 years after England's expulsion of the Jews in 1392 is just an imaginary presence for Foxe, is nevertheless a presence he quite readily recruits to figure the unassimilable other, the unconquerable nation within nations, a culture, a religion, and a people whose very resilience marks for Foxe the limit of the printing presses, or indeed the Holy Ghost's power to effect change. Okay, here is a more recent account of printing. There we go. This is Marshall McLuhan. He was a professor at the University of Toronto in the mid-20th century, and he became famous as, to quote this 1969 Playboy magazine interview, a high priest of pop cult in new media. McLuhan was, with Harold Innis, founder of the so-called Toronto School of Communication Theory, which popularized the idea, still pervasive in Western societies, that the modern age began with printing. That as the printed book gives way to electronic forms of communication, we can see in hindsight the shape of modernity itself. So, in this theory, modernity is the era after Gutenberg, and now Zuckerberg has kicked off a new era. According to McLuhan, printing prescribes modernity's every move. He tells Playboy that printing was, quote, it worked that time, directly responsible for the rise of such disparate phenomena as nationalism, the Reformation, the assembly line and its offspring, the Industrial Revolution, the whole concept of causality, Cartesian and Newtonian concepts of the universe, perspective in art, narrative chronology in literature, and a psychological mode of introspection or inner direction. That last effect leads inexorably, as it were, from printing that brought learning, from learning that enlightened, to the enlightenment of the self, the Christian informed, yet also secular self-knowledge of the modern Western individual subject. Now, this may be believable enough for Playboy readers, but like Fox, McLuhan encounters some obstacles to the elaboration of his thought in the book that made him famous, The Gutenberg Galaxy, The Making of Typographical Man. McLuhan's foundational argument in Gutenberg Galaxy is that different modes and technologies of human communication in themselves determine the nature of human society. The medium, whether printed book or radio broadcast, is the message that humans receive and live by. This claim unfolds by way of reconsideration of all modes of human communication through the whole of human history. The scope is so huge that whenever I reread this book, I think, wow, man, the 60s, crazy times. I can't do that anymore. Anyway, McLuhan argues that oral language, handwriting, and all non-phonetic written languages, so for example, hieroglyphic, pictographic, or ideogrammatic languages, these produce tribal, uncivilized, illiterate societies. He uses those words, he says, technically. Tribal means societies in which words have a hot, intimate, and incantatory power. He suggests this is archetypally the case in rural Africa, but that the conditions are also those of all of global pre-modernity and of everywhere in the world in the present day outside of the West. Every society except modern Western society is more or less tribal in his technical sense. This seems it includes Jewish societies. At least when McLuhan writes in passing about Leopold Bloom, the Jewish protagonist of James Joyce's Ulysses, he says that because he is a Jew, Bloom must be detribalized. And I'll come back to this. Against tribal societies are McLuhan's civilized and literate societies. These have their origins in ancient Rome, but literate civilization is only fully realized after printing comes to Europe. McLuhan defines civilization technically as a communications regime in which language is recorded using an alphabet through which sound is distanced from the body. Alphabetic letters break words into sounds, he says, and thus render language a visual rather than an auditory medium. When printed, this disembodied language spreads sequential, linear, and abstract thought, and thus produces the cool rationality of typographical man. That, in turn, produces all the things McLuhan lists in Playboy, from industrialization to artistic perspective, the Western conditions of the modern. The final step in McLuhan's argument is to say that now that Western humans are the subjects of a new regime of telephones, TV, radio, computation, he had no idea what was coming, but anyway, they are returning to pre-literate, uncivilized, hot-headed habits. Electronic media are affecting a new epochal change, he suggests. They are turning the word into what McLuhan so famously calls, quote, a global village, that's his coinage, structured around new human tribes made by their media. Now, one reason that McLuhan is still famous is that some of what he argues, especially that last bit, has continued to have striking explanatory force. McLuhan never got to see X, formerly Twitter, or the comments on Instagram feeds. He missed all that irrational hate and uncivilizing misinformation. But his word for what has happened in those spaces, tribalism, has entered our lexicon, and we use it because it seems to fit. I will come back to the matter of new digital media and present-day tribalism a little later in the talk. For now, I will note that McLuhan's ideas about the earlier print revolution, so not the digital one, the printing one, they've also remained very influential. The claim that printing changed pretty much everything still echoes through our news feeds. Here is Euronews in 2022 reporting that Gutenberg's Bible was the first step in a process that changed, quote, the entire planet. I think I should show you a picture of this planet-changing book. There you go. this is the leaf that the Cloud Library has. It's just over there, and I took a photo of it and put it on my slide. The Gutenberg Bible. Oh, I just accidentally went to page 18 instead of whatever page I was on. This will take a little bit of time. This is why you should print things out. There's a joke in there somewhere that you got. Okay, I'm past typographical man. Here we go. Okay. McLuhan's argument also has persistent academic force. Here is a 2022 academic book that gives the Gutenberg galaxy a fresh start as the Gutenberg parenthesis. And I should here mention also the scholar Elizabeth Eisenstein. She published this landmark 1982 volume study, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, which is a more detailed, more historicized study than McLuhan's, and for many academics, a highly influential one, as argue the contributors to a 2018 tribute volume called Agent of Change. Revisiting her famous book in an article in 2002, Eisenstein, it's clear that it was always her purpose to show, quote, the advance of Western civilization as an effect of printing. So McLuhan isn't entirely out there. He was in a space of scholarship along these lines. Indeed, scholar Trish Lachlan observes that the whole discipline of book history, quote, has trouble not thinking about the book, especially the printed book, as, quote, the agent of Western liberal tradition. That is, we have trouble thinking about European civilization as anything other than the work of a machine, the printing press. Thus, McLuhan's argument is a paradigmatic one about the West. This is the West as brought to you by the inventiveness of Westerners, by the Roman alphabet, the Christian codex, German movable type, and now American digital media. It's a big argument, like I said, the 60th man, but it's also a troubled one. Remember John Fox, whose Protestant Christian print triumphalism is disturbed by spectral Catholic monks and unconverted Jews. McLuhan's Gutenberg story is similarly haunted by the Canaanites who used phonetic alphabets for Semitic language long before the Romans used an alphabet, or by pagan and Jewish merchants who folded leather into early codex form notebooks before there were Christian biblical codices. It's also haunted by Chinese, Korean, Tibetan, and Japanese Buddhists who, in the middle of the 7th century, 8 centuries before Gutenberg, started using xylographic woodblocks to print extracts from sutras like these. And who experimented with clay and metal movable type from the 11th century forward. This is the first book that was printed, that survives, that was printed using movable type. It's not Gutenberg's, it's a Korean school book from 1377. In a Chinese text composed in 10,005, the Emperor Zhenzong asks the Confucian scholar Jingbing how many woodblocks for book printing are kept in the Publications Office of China's Directorate of Education. So this is in 10,005, it's a long time ago, 1,000 years ago. Jingbing replies, quote, today, there are more than 100,000. The classics and histories, together with standard commentaries, are all fully represented. When I was young, there were only 1 or 2 scholars in every 100 who possessed copies of all the classics and commentaries. There was no way to copy so many works. Today, printed editions of these works are abundant, and officials and commoners alike have them in their homes. In the Gutenberg galaxy, McLuhan is aware, at least vaguely, of the long history of book printing in East Asia, and it is a problem that his argument about Western modernity keeps bumping up against. That's because, as Jingbing suggests, the printing press really did transform imperial China, but it didn't westernize it in McLuhan's terms. Printing in China did not lead directly to the Reformation, the Assembly Line, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. Whereas John Fox blamed Jews and friars for their own stubborn refusal to be converted, McLuhan finds reason to forgive the Chinese for not becoming Western or modern, despite their transformative print technology. He assigns blame to their ideographic writing system, and I've already mentioned this. He suggests that ideograms do not represent phonemes, but rather whole ideas. As a result, they do not impose an abstract visual order on the intimate chaos of embodied language in the way alphabetic scripts do. And thus, quote, yep, the Chinese culture is considerably more refined and perceptive than the Western world has ever been, but the Chinese are tribal, people of the ear. Civilization must now be used technically to mean detribalized man, for whom the visual values have priority in the organization of thought and action. And thus, as Western literate communities encounter the various primitive or auditory communities still remaining in the world, great confusion occurs. This is 1962, just to be clear. Areas like China and India are still audio-tactile in the main. Such phonetic literacy as has penetrated there has altered very little. No matter what Jinping tells the emperor 1,000 years ago. I would ask you to notice the similarities here between the impenetrable Chinese and Indians and Fox's impenetrable Jews and Roman Catholics. To quote Fox again, let me put this slide back up. When the Holy Ghost speaketh to them in innumerable sorts of books, yet, sorry, there we go. Oh, no, I don't actually, I don't have that slide. When the Holy Ghost speaketh to them in innumerable sorts of books, yet they will not be converted. McLuhan, however, mostly avoids opining, unlike Fox, on Jewish people or Hebrew books. He does quote several times passages from the historian David Diringer's book on the history of the alphabet, where it surfaces the connection between early Hebrew and Phoenician alphabets. But McLuhan himself never writes about Hebrew letters. And of the Phoenicians, he says, they hacked the alphabet out of the Egyptians' hieroglyphic culture, but this did not release any further intellectual or artistic activity in them. As I've already said, the only time McLuhan himself talks about Judaism is when he mentions a tribalized Jew, Leopold Bloom, in Joyce's novel Ulysses. I have read in an article by a former director of research for the National Council of Jewish Day Schools about a lecture McLuhan gave to a Jewish working man's group in the 1970s, when he suggested that it is the privileging of the oral in Jewish education that has kept Hebrew alphabets and printed books from changing Jewish people. The logic seems to be, and this is all very secondhand, but sure, Jewish people have innumerable books, but they're not like Westerners. They are audio-tactile, tribal, like Africans, Indians, the Chinese, and all other pre-modern and non-Western peoples. Okay, it's time to say the quiet part of this out loud, and I shouldn't smile as I say this. It's all very well for me, a white lady from New Zealand. But anyway, McLuhan's reasoning is perilously close to classical scientific racism. Here I mean the variety of racism often traced back to Carl Linnaeus, who, distinguishing the races of men in the 1758 edition of Systema Naturae, describes the black African man as slothful and the white European man as an inventor. McLuhan's version is not as essentializing as classical scientific racism. His Jewish Leopold Bloom can be detribalized when assimilated into Western urban culture. For McLuhan, a medium is the message. So if the medium changes, people change. Their tribalism is not in their DNA. Presumably, if the Chinese switched to printing in alphabetical letters, they could be detribalized too. I think that's the logic. But McLuhan may be being technical as he says it, but he's also still saying it, that all cultures other than white Western culture are uncivilized. I just did that again. If you press that key, you don't go down, you go through hundreds of your page, hundreds and hundreds of your leaves. Okay, this was like an important punchline, so I'm going to do it again. He's saying that all cultures, other than white Western culture, are uncivilized, irrational, and tribal. And we know that claims like that are incredibly dangerous. I've made, but I'm not going to labor this point, it's actually a terrible one now when anti-Semitic and other hatreds are surging. And what I really want to do is actually stop talking about McLuhan's communications theory, because in case you haven't got this point, I don't like it. And I want to start talking about Hebrew printing, and I'm sure you want me to as well. So I'll bring this part of my talk to a synthetic end. McLuhan, along with everyone who unthinkingly or unknowingly picks up his ideas, is always pursuing two interwoven lines of argument. The first is that communications technologies, including books, determine the way that people think and form societies. By this reasoning, our society is overrun by misinformation about vaccination, for example, because of the new media that carry that misinformation. McLuhan's second line of argument flows from the first tautologically. The Western technology of printing determined the Westernness of Western society. Other printing traditions, for instance, Hebrew printing, did not make other societies, for instance, Jewish society, Western, because other printing traditions were not Western versions of printing. This is exhausting. And it leads to places I don't want to go. For example, to a world in which new media are doing to our society, what new media are doing to our society right now, for instance, threatening democracy, increasing polarization, is inescapable, just like modernity was inescapable for the entire planet once Gutenberg printed that Bible. Here is a simple alternative. Books, like all human technologies, so this is an alternative to the printing revolution, sort of McLuhan theory. Books, like all human technologies, have affordances that open up some possibilities for their human users and constrain others. Trolls couldn't troll so well without the comments sections in digital media, so that's a new possibility that wasn't there in printed newspapers. Conversely, it's very hard to cancel or destroy words once you posted them digitally, so that's a constraint. But the technology that creates these new possibilities and constraints does not determine or fix the myriad ways that those constraints and possibilities become lived human experience. You can build digital media that do not have comment sections. You can build algorithms that let senders recall emails and delete all trace of them. You can censor the internet, or you can let it be a free-for-all. And what is true of new media is also true of old media. You can use a printing press to share accounts of Newtonian physics widely and enlighten the world, or you can print books that show local women giving wax dolls to the devil to promote their persecution as witches. Here's such a printed book right here. You can use the printing press for your Christianizing schemes, or you can use it to print the Torah. That is what Fox realizes, that's what Fox realizes, that the printing press isn't going to convert all the Catholics any more than the preaching of Christian gospel converted the Jews. Printing, like preaching, affects change in lots of different ways, not just the Protestant Christian way that Fox wants. And this is just what I think early Hebrew printing shows. Not printing as a unidirectional westernizing force, not modern inevitabilities or certain endings, but myriad possibilities for example, transnational and cross-cultural technological borrowings and innovations that enabled the building of Jewish community and the sharing of Jewish thought. Possibilities of a lucrative new trade for a diasporic and often precarious people. The possibility of learned texts, but also printed incantatory ones. So don't press that. I was just about to press that one. That would take me to the end of my paper again, but I didn't. So you see, you can use technology in different ways. The earliest printing of Hebrew, or as you're about to see, sort of Hebrew, that I know of is just that, an incantatory magical text. It is a printed amulet in the collection of the University of Utah. Oh, no, I want to go back. There we go. University of Utah. And it dates from the mid to late 1200s. It's one of about 50 Egyptian printed amulets in collections in private hands around the world. The provenance of some of these is a bit obscure, probably because they were smuggled out of Egypt. But it seems that many were excavated in the 20th century at the old city of Fustat, now part of Cairo. Under the Fatimid Caliphate, so up to about 1250, Fustat was a famously diverse, multi-faith, multi-urban community. It was where the physician and philosopher Maimonides, who you all know better than I do, emigrated in 1168 following his exile from Cordoba in Spain, and where he wrote his famous Mishneh Torah. After Maimonides' time, Fustat came under the rule of the Mamluks. There was more persecution, though as yet no expulsions of local Christian or Jewish communities. I'm mentioning the Mamluks because this book was likely printed under their mid-13th century regime, and because that was also a time they formed a key alliance with the Mongols of the Golden Horde. Notably, in exactly that period, the late 1200s, when this book was printed, is also when the Mongols started printing banknotes using metal and wooden blocks. They also experimented with clay type at this time to print banknotes. It's usually assumed that they learned their print techniques from their conquest of Uyghur and Tibetan peoples who'd been practicing woodblock printing in the East Asian tradition for 2 centuries by this time. I think it's worth thinking about North African printed amulets like this one as evidence of these kind of broad multi-directional Eurasian movements of printing technologies. This amulet is not printed with movable type, it's printed from a metal block onto paper. And printing of this kind was probably centuries old in North Africa by 1250 or so. Abu Dulaf al-Khazari, author in 10th century Persia, calls the blocks that were used to print amulets like this tash. He says, quote, "The engraver of tash is he who engraves molds for amulets. People who are illiterate and cannot write buy them from him." The magical charm printed here, for those who cannot write, is in Arabic. Around it in the frame are words in Arabic, but also Syriac, Coptic, and something resembling Hebrew. And that's the bit I'm going to enlarge. Nope. Oh, I'm going backwards now. Oh, there we go. So my very generous collaborator, Dr. Sienna, has this to say about the Hebrew in the border of this amulet. Quote, "While I do think these are Hebrew letters, I don't believe they spell anything legible in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, or any other Jewish language. This fragment is discussed, I'm still quoting Noam here, is discussed inter alia in Carl Schaefer's book, Enigmatic Charms, and in Christina Richardson's book chapter, A New Narrative of Pre-Modern Afro-Eurasian Printing, which cites several literary examples of the use of Hebrew or pseudo-Hebrew by Muslim magicians as a type of magical language. This is Noam, have seen modern parallels in North African amulets as well in both directions, Jews using Arabic characters and Muslims using Hebrew. So that's my guess as to what's going on here. A Muslim or Christian artisan is copying and using Hebrew characters as part of a summoning of the magic of a local minority community. If I had to transcribe it, I would get to something like this. Is that... Oh, I didn't do a very good job of doing that, but that's as good as he could get. And he gives us those letters. In the book, Enigmatic Charms, that Dr. Sienna pointed me to, Carl Schaefer cites another contemporary source for this sort of Hebrew printing. And so I'll quote that here. No, that's not what I wanted. No, that's also not what I want. No. Oh, yeah, that was the one where I was going to show you Noam transcribing the Hebrew text that he could see. Okay, this is the quotation. So this appears in a divan written by Safi al-Din al-Hil, whose dates are 1278 to 1348. And it refers to the creation of amulets by carving or molding. He says, "In making molds from tin, for turning out amulets and charms, how often has my hand written on the mold in the script of Syriac, and then that of phylactery writing." And Carl Schaefer indicates that that is the term he uses for Hebrew. Now, raised as I was on stories about Gutenberg's invention of printing, I knew nothing about North African tash, nor about the printing of amulets like this. Like, I knew about East Asian printing, I knew about European printing, nothing in between. I find that this book, and I need to go back to this book. There it is. This book, replete with possibility and multi-directionality. It points to a long tradition of amulet production in manuscript and print, and in many languages, scripts, and media. Abigail Bacon included in this exhibition a 1462 Iraqi manuscript from the Cloud Library, which contains magical amuletic text. So you can look at that. Oh, in fact, you can look at it on my screen, apparently, according to my notes. There you go. It's over there, and it's up here as well. The Fustat amulet, to go back to it, there we go, points to cross-cultural borrowings in a multi-faith and multilingual environment, or, and I'm going to quote Rabbi Skloot's paper from earlier today, it points to chaotic multi-ethnic mix in which ritual practices blur boundaries between people. And it points to an incantatory power of words. It's a power that may sometimes be eliminated, as McLuhan suggests, by printing. But we can see here that it can also be recruited and promulgated by print technology. Okay, my next example, I'm going to have two more examples, is a book that if you follow some recent scholarship, you will know might be the second oldest surviving example of printed Hebrew. And in this case, it's actually readable, meaningful Hebrew. It is a fragment of a Hebrew Siddur or Haggadah. Moshe Rosenfeld, a Jerusalem bookseller, some of you probably know, found it in 2015 in an old bookbinding. Rosenfeld has spent the past several years investigating this fragment with colleagues from the Israeli Institute for Computerized Bibliography of the Hebrew book. They have argued that the type font that is used here bears no relationship to type used by any other early European Jewish printer. It appears inexpert, they say, even experimental. It may therefore be early, the work of someone who didn't have other fonts to copy. And here are some examples of the letters that the research team have isolated to prove that these are not very good letters. There are many very wonky lamets. Now, I don't have an opinion on this because that seems dangerous. I know that many students of Hebrew typography are a bit skeptical about it, but I will say this. I am persuaded by Rosenfeld and team's analysis of the watermark evidence. This is the watermark that appears on the fabric, on the fragment. It is identifiably paper from Fabriano in Italy, and it's paper that was made not later than 1440. Old stocks of paper were sometimes used in much later books, but Gerhard Pickard, who in the mid-20th century recorded the watermarks in thousands of early printed books, suggests that most late medieval paper, just statistically, gets used within 3 or 4 years after it is made. So it may be that Rosenfeld and his collaborators are right when they argue that this Siddur is from an unknown Hebrew press operating after 1440, but not long after. That is, before Gutenberg printed his first surviving Bible of 1445, or 1442 to 1445. From there, the Israeli researchers make a real leap to a story about Hebrew printing in France in the early 1440s. It's a story that's either been dismissed as nonsense or skated over as irrelevant in all the landmark histories, or all but one that I can find, of Western printing. And I'm going to tell you the story now. So some of you will know it and probably have heard that it's nonsense, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. In Avignon in the 1440s, a notary made a contract for Prokop Waldvogel, a metal worker from Prague, who had left the devastation of the Hussite Wars sometime in the 1430s. Prokop's co-signatory in Avignon was a Davin de Cadarus, described in the contract as a Jew and a dyer. In a 1444 document, Davin agrees to invest in Prokop's new business, which the notary records will involve casting steel alphabets for Avignon locals to use to make books. In the second contract in 1446, Davin agrees to instruct Prokop, quote, in the art of dyeing, no, gone too far, or maybe I haven't. Oh, okay. In the art of dyeing well, faithfully, and perfectly without fire. That is to say, the trade secret of cold dyeing using mordants. In return, Prokop will, quote, make and having made, provide and deliver 27 Hebrew characters properly formed and cast in iron, in keeping with the knowledge and practice of writing, which the above Procopius, so he affirms, has taught the above Jew these past 2 years, and with this to provide him with devices of wood, pewter, and iron. A month later, they changed the terms. This is still 1446. Davin won't teach Prokop dyeing, will return him some money, but he also will retain his Hebrew alphabet, plus, quote, all the machines, devices, and instruments designed for artificial writing in Latin letters. This is so great, it gets its own slide, even though it's only a few words. I love this. So Rosenfeld and his collaborators Leap connects this book, here it is, the fragment that they found in 2015, to this documentary evidence of printing in early 1440s Avignon. They suggest that the first surviving book printed in Europe was not Gutenberg's Christian Bible, but this Hebrew Siddur. Perhaps they leap too far. It just said here, perhaps they leap, and I'm like, they definitely leap. But I think what I meant to write was, perhaps they leap too far. But I do think they're right to remind book historians of that story about Prokop and Devine, because it is the earliest textual evidence that survives that describes the casting of metal type anywhere in the world. And to me, what is interesting about it is not the firstness, but the interconnectedness. A Bohemian migrant who has somewhere learned or figured out how to make steel alphabets partners with a Jewish businessman to make metal letters in Roman and in Hebrew in order to print books for the Jewish and Christian people of a town in Avignon. In this story of printing, transnational movement and cross-cultural exchange open up new possibilities for the future. Maybe that future never happened. Like I don't know. I think it's kind of wishful thinking that this is the book. But even if that future never happened, it's an amazing story and it should be told more often. I have one more amazing book to show you. In the end, book historians, make arguments and stuff, but all we really want to do is just show you books. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, for those who are not at my shorter talk this morning, this is a copy, and those who were, there's going to be some repetition, I apologize. But this is a copy of the Arba Turim, a Jewish legal text. It's a copy from the Fisher Red Book Library in Toronto, and I've been working on it with Dr. Sienna, Sharon, and Lockhart, while Drs. Morton and Sagan have been running around the country, examining, or indeed around the world, examining individual copies in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And the British Library, and then just last week in the Pierpont Morgan Library and Princeton University Library. The Clow holds 2 copies of this book, one of which is in the exhibit, and, oh no, there we go, one of which is in the exhibit, that's my photo of it there, and both copies of which are next on our list to do some research on. I have to leave at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning, so it won't be tomorrow, but don't worry, we'll come back. As some of you likely know, the tour is an important legal treatise by Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, who was born in Cologne, emigrated to Spain with his father in the 1200s, and composed the text in Toledo in about 1300. Its eponymous 4 parts treat in order devotional, ritualistic, marital, and civil Jewish law. It discusses prayers, blessings, the Sabbath, holy days, fasting, marriage, the marriage contract, and divorce. It was a handbook for living for the late medieval Jewish diaspora, and dozens of manuscript copies of the text survive. This, for example, is the copy that Abigail Bacon pulled out. And actually, Abigail, are you here? What's its date? Roughly 15th century. And where do we think it's from? Where do we? I've got no idea. That's why I'm asking you. Yeah, that's right. Look, he's going to go and check the thing. Anyway, it's an example of an Arba Turim manuscript from the Canterbury Library.
1486.
1486. So it's about the time actually that the text is getting widely printed as well. Anyway, there were lots of manuscript copies too. And here is the Fisher copy again. It's not a manuscript, it's a printed book, printed on December the 13th, 1493 in Constantinople on the press of the brothers David and Samuel ibn Nafius. That makes it the earliest book known to have been printed in Turkey or anywhere in the then Ottoman or former Byzantine Empire. But again, while this book, while interesting as something locally new, is also part of a larger and longer story of global movement and interconnectedness that I think makes it more interesting. The Ibn Namius brothers were Jews from Spain, perhaps from the town of Ejar in Aragon, where books were printed in the 1480s using decorative capitals and borders that the Ibn Namius brothers used in this book. The brothers left Spain, as did thousands of other Jews in the period following the 1492 decree, expelling Spanish Jews who would not convert to Christianity. They traveled first to Naples, where they acquired the type they used to print the tour from the shop of a Jewish printer called Joshua Soncino from Naples. Soncino had printed his own edition of the Arba Turim in 1490 from several manuscript sources. One of those manuscripts was the book that the brothers used for their copy. They carried it with them when they headed to Constantinople in 1493, perhaps to escape a plague epidemic that was devastating Naples. In Constantinople, the brothers knew they'd find a vibrant Jewish community of Romaniot Jews whose families had lived there for centuries, of more recent Northern European Jewish refugees, of Jews from Ottoman lands in the Balkans and Turkey, who had been encouraged to come to the great former Byzantine port after the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed took the city in 1453 and found it emptied by years of war. By 1493, when the Ibn Namias brothers printed their book, Jews made up 10% of the Constantinople population. And the new Sultan permitted Jews to practice some trades and crafts, and the Ibn Namias brothers added printing to those crafts. And this was a time when the Ottoman Empire, indeed for the next 150 years, eschewed printing. It was not a technology that they needed really to run their massive empire, which tells you something about tells you something about what printing does and doesn't do, I think. Surviving copies of the 1493 Arbitrum build on this story of printing as work enabled by interconnected local and distributed global networks. There were no paper mills in Turkey. The Ottomans relied on stocks from Venice and Valencia. Sure enough, some paper in the copies of the 1493 Turim that I and collaborators have examined bear watermarks typical of Italian paper mills. We have also found 2 copies, one in the British Library, one in the Pierpont Morgan Library, containing a single leaf bearing a glove and flower watermark that appears to point to a paper mill in Valencia. But most of the paper in the 5 copies of the Turim that I and my collaborators have looked at, there's this watermark, a tête de bœuf, or an ox head with flower. The great bibliographer of Hebrew books, A.K. Offenberg, identified this tête de bœuf stock as Italian. We think he was wrong, which is a scary thing to think, but we're going with it. We're almost certain that the paper comes from further north in Germany. And that's quite nice because it returns the story rather neatly to the birthplace of the Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, the author of the text. As I explained in my paper this morning, the arrangement of the watermark paper leaves also tells the story. The Italian and Valencian sheets and copies of the Constantinople tour appear systematically in places where we think the book needed correction. So they appear in the same place in all the different copies. But the brothers used stock of German paper consistently elsewhere. And that's unusual for a Turkish book in this period. There's very little German paper in Constantinople books from this period. In fact, I don't know of any other German paper in Constantinople. So it does seem possible that the brothers obtained paper for their edition while they were in Europe. They carried it to Constantinople. But then when they found they needed to print some pages anew because they had to have proof checked, they used local sources to print off the new sheets. A further Northern European connection for the brothers may be established by the copy at the Bodleian in Oxford. It's in an alum-toured sheepskin leather binding with blind tool decoration and metalwork that is typical not of North African books, but of German books in the late 15th century. So maybe the Spanish Ibn Namias brothers' networks brought them paper from Germany and then they moved their wares back to the north. Or, and I actually think this might be more likely, they worked alongside a German-trained binder in their new city, perhaps an Ashkenazi Jewish refugee. Okay, a few more pictures. Oh, no. Okay. This slide shows some very recent work we've been doing on erased manuscript and annotations in the Fisher copies. A lot of you saw this morning. Using near-infrared as well as UV light and the high magnification, we've identified 2 ownership inscriptions, and one in Judeo-Arabic and one in Hebrew. And one of those inscriptions informs us that the purchaser of the book was called Shlomo, which is very sweet. And in another one of the copies, we uncovered a hidden inscription that seems to be in Arabic proper. The copy at the Princeton University Library, meantime, has a full page of annotations in a North African Jewish hand, calculating the days on which high holidays will fall for the Jewish years 5280 to 5287. So that's 1519 to 1527 of the Common Era. Okay, that's my last cool book. And I think though some of you for your patience because you'd heard about it before, it is time for me to conclude. I'm going to conclude by asking you to notice how often Jewish bookmakers and Hebrew texts turn up in really pivotal circumstances within the story of the global development of early printing. Development may be the wrong word. I'm trying to think of another one. I feel like these technologies, they rise and then sometimes they vanish and then they rise again. It's not quite development. For John Fox, you may remember, Jews figured the disappointing likelihood that even as printing spread the Christian gospel far and wide, still there would be some people who would not be converted. The Jewish experience is paradigmatic in other ways, I think, than the way Fox suggests. The first book printed in Turkey was a Hebrew Abba Turim, a text that was a lifeline for Europe's Jews in the later Middle Ages, offering to a scattered people who were moving constantly at that point across national, cultural, and geographical boundaries, a way to build and be in community with one another over space and over time. Printing came to Turkey, as it did to Avignon, in the hands of displaced people forced by war or persecution to restart their lives. That's the case for Prokop Wolfvogel from Prague, looking for new opportunities to support themselves. Printing was used by people like the Jews, Muslims, and Christians in 13th century Fustat, people who inhabited multi-faith, multilingual urban spaces that were connected to the world by trade and travel and by the movement of technology, texts, and ideas. The story of the book in this framing is not a story about printing's creation of the West or of modernity. Rather, it is a story of the extraordinarily diverse ways that human beings keep and share over time and space the knowledge that matters most to them. And that is the story that I hope, through this research, we will be able to keep telling. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your interesting and beautiful lecture. So this is the book.
So I was so young when I wrote that book. I look at it.
Questions?
Thank you very much. I was wondering, because you showed like this very global angle of how you think about printings, and you focus on Hebrew printings, is there anything that you think that's specifically Jewish in the way Jewish printing?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
So I'll answer it first by saying that in a way that's a question that I'm trying to figure out. And I was aware I hadn't figured it out for this paper. Like last night, I couldn't sleep a bit because I was like, oh, I'm not quite sure what I'm saying about Jewish communities and Hebrew printing, in the sense of, are we making I'm definitely making an argument that if you attend to Hebrew printing, which tends to get left out of these big stories of the history of the book, you're going to find what I said at the end, right? Which is, evidence of the diversity of lived experience that runs counter to those kind of teleological and totalizing things. But I do have a hunch, rather than an argument, that Hebrew printing and the books of Jewish peoples allow one to unlock or open up that history somewhat differently from books of other kinds of communities. And I think it's probably about diaspora and also coherence, right? So it's about, and someone started to say this in a question this morning, it was Rabbi Splut. He said, look, there you are. You said, look, the tour, right, is such a book. It's a text and a book, and what it's doing is bringing together a scattered people, and it does it in manuscript and in print. It's not determined by the medium, but it is about the particular needs of a particular diasporic nation, if you like. And so I think Fox is right to say, okay, I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with I want printing to make modernity, like McLuhan says it does, and it's going to be Christian, Protestant Christian. We don't want any monks. And then he's like, oh, but I think, it's the example of the Jews which is going to hold us up here, because there is something about a people who are able to maintain. I use the word resilience, the resilience of a culture. I mean, like I'm standing here, I'm not Jewish, that many of you are, so I apologize because I feel this is somewhat objectifying. But the resilience of a culture and a people over millennia, and their interconnectedness over those millennia through texts and books. I think that's it, because I think that defies the argument that the medium is the message, I think. So that was a little incoherent, but I think my answer is yes. And someone said at lunchtime, and it was probably a simpler way of putting it, Jews are all over the place, they said, right? And so that is distinctive when compared with other. It's not distinctive in the modern world, right? Many communities and cultures are now diasporic, but in the pre-modern world, it is quite distinctive. So anyway, that's a go at that. And I feel like everybody in the room knows more about this or has thought more deeply about this than I have, but I'm very interested in trying to get better to grips with that question.
Dr. Kalman?
So excuse a rather naive question. We were just discussing, right, there's a debate in Jewish circles about whether Rashi's commentary on Gersoni's commentary on Job are the first Hebrew books printed, which never really made a good sense to me as the first thing to print.
No, you'd think a siddur would be, or an amulet.
The liturgical text would likely be, right? And in the case of an incantation, it's a single page.
Yeah.
Commercial value.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, amazing, right? And it's so easy to make a block and just print them off. I mean,
say anything about sort of the global perception of a first? What are the first things printed?
The first things printed, that's a really good question. The first things printed, so, I mean, I worry a little bit about this first thing thing, but nonetheless, I'm going to do it. We all do it, and I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, so the earliest surviving printed book that survives, I think this is crucial, right? Because these are just the ones we have. Surely a lot is lost, but is a Dharani in Sanskrit, but it is dug up in a grave in Tufan in what is now northwest China, what was then to northwest China. So it's a little extract from a sutra on immaculate radiance, just a few lines, and it's an incantatory text, right? It's a prayer that you carry, it's an amulet that you carry around with you. Very soon after that, the Japanese, the Koreans, and other Chinese people are printing these little sutra extracts in the, I mean, there are people who say in the millions, but certainly in the hundreds of thousands, and thousands survive from the 8th century Japan, for example, and hundreds from 8th century Korea. Sometimes they're in little shrines, right? So they're part of a devotional practice. So that to me is similar to I mean, amulets are different because, you know, the magical and incantatory thing is very different from a sutra, which is Buddhist scripture, but still, kinds of, I feel like I come back to Rabbi Scroots, kinds of ritual embodied devotional practice seems to be a really important early thing. But that point about scripture is key as well, right? So liturgical books in scripture, this seems very important. So Gutenberg he prints two things which belong in this tradition. He prints a Bible, and you all know about that. But probably at around the same time, he prints indulgences, so letters of confession, or what we call pardons. These are not actually pardons. What they are letters saying that you will be pardoned if you confess at the end of your life. And they really arose over the previous 75 years before Gutenberg as a technology to, a bit like a pilgrim's certificate, which is another thing that gets printed in Arabic in the 13th century. 13th, 14th, similarly to amulets. It's something which is it's really a souvenir, for want of a better word. It's a record of an embodied devotional practice, pilgrimage on the one hand, or confession on the other. So that's quite consistent across it. One exception. The Mongolians, Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Chinese do also like printing banknotes. And of course, print technology is deeply connected to both seal technology, which is very 5,000-year-old technology, and coin casting, the casting of metal money, and then eventually paper money as well. So money, religion, like money, devotional practices, and scripture, and especially liturgical scripture as it connects to the liturgy. And that's kind of it really. So I think this skepticism that these were the first things printed, I will join you in that skepticism. There you go. This was such a long answer, sorry.
Oh, great, thank you.
Dr. Hollow? No.
Sorry? Oh, okay.
Okay, Dr.
No. I just wanted to comment on, first of all, I want to thank you for your distinction between the totalizing teleological approach of and your really key question, which is what does print do well for a given?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. What does it do? And the answer is it depends on what you want it to do.
It doesn't do well for me. And so in some ways, the question is, what did it do well for the Jews?
Yeah.
And what do we learn about Judaism in the human condition by virtue of comparing and contrasting? I'd like to build on Jason's question. It seems to me, based on the earliest, even if it isn't Gersonides or Rashi, in and of themselves, either one of them, but the fact that it's the Turim, that it's Gersonides, it's Rashi, and it's the Tanakh, it's the Bible, it's variety, I think is an important cultural lesson that is a mirror to what you described as the geographical dispersion. I think the geographical dispersion, the capacity for the Jews for print to be glue, social glue, is very important. But I think that there's a dispersed canonicity of Jewishness, which this also illustrates. And it's at the minimum, it's a mediated canonicity, which it's unlikely that they would have produced just the Hebrew Bible without Rush, or without Gesundheit, without the Turin, and all the other things.
Yes.
Only individual books, right? It's on. We've got one on Job and one on part of the Torah, right? But they're not whole, which is an interesting dynamic.
Which
So I recently read, many of you probably read it long ago, Jonathan Ray's book about the Sephardi Jews and the expulsion, and was very compelled by it. I was like, yep, this makes a lot of sense. I don't really know the arguments he's arguing against, but his idea that Sephardic Jewish identity is something that was created in the 16th century by a people. And what I liked about that was he was talking about what it would be like being a Jewish person living in a town in Iberia prior to and he's like, probably your identity, I mean, there probably is religious identity and so on, but it's probably quite local. It's to do with localized practice. And then you've got your city identity and your merchant identity and so on. And he said, but expulsion, right, changes that. And I think about, this is, I don't know, like, but I think about that Hussite fleeing from the Hussite wars in Prague, right, and turning up in Avignon, and he's the one who's doing this deal. And then I think about printing arriving in Portugal, in Faro for the first time in the hands of someone expelled from Spain, right? So the first books printed in Portugal are Jewish liturgical books, Hebrew liturgical books. Same with Turkey and so on. And I think about the 15th century as this century of expulsion for Jewish people. I mean, the 60s, right? England, Germany, and so on. You know the history. That's also the century in which printing, all sorts of things happen. Well, there's the fall of Constantinople, there's the fall of Constantinople as well. So there's big dynamic shift, but there's the scattering of people, and the people who are scattered are the people of the book. And the people who are scattered use books to rebuild identity in these new places. I mean, that's the point, one of the points that Ray's making, right? Books and other kinds of practices. And I find myself thinking about the connection between that precarity, that well, you know, I have a friend, Islet Cooper, who I mentioned earlier, is a friend who works on Yiddish literature immediately after the Holocaust, and she talks about the way in which the literature, writing, books is healing and recovery, right? It's rebuilding. Not all cultures necessarily rebuild with books, but she suggests that's a common feature in Jewish community. So anyway, I don't quite know what I'm saying there, except that it is in the context of expulsion and dispersal that a lot of this is occurring, and of rebuilding.
Okay, so thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
I'm okay if folks.
So the document that was uncovered in 2015.
Yeah.
In the province of Murphy based on.
Yeah.
But is that the oldest example of a printed Haggadah?
If the dating is correct, then it is, but that's what's disputed. So I, by the way, think it's possible. Wow. I think it's going to be possible, easier to, okay, start again. I'm getting tired. I believe that if I go to Jerusalem and say to Moshe Rosenfeld, I'm here with machines, I would like to take signatures from your chemical signatures from your book, it may be possible to get closer to a final answer about how old that is. There are those who say that the type that he and his colleagues are saying looks early and experimental and so on actually looks 16th century. They're like, we don't think this is that old at all. But I have to say, it would be strange to print a book in the 16th century on 1440s paper. It's not unheard of, but strange. So anyway, if it is from the 1440s, yes, it's the earliest printed Haggadah. It's also just the earliest printed book in Europe, or roughly about, or contemporaneously with the Gutenberg Bible.
He's claimed before, so this is his claim.
Yeah. It's very sort of strange to me that people don't talk about the Avignon thing, because even if you ignore that fragment, as I say, there's still a story. I mean, people do mention it. They're like, oh, people were experimenting with type in Haarlem and Holland, and there may be some people experimenting in Avignon, but quite a lot of people say that's obviously just a nonsense story. I'm like, it's notarized documents. It's not nonsense, but clearly it happened. So you've got simultaneously a lot of work going on the attempt to build, the attempt to make books in a new way simultaneously in a couple of decades there in Europe. That's been said before, but no, very little attention has been paid to the involvement of this Jewish community in Avignon.